Here we are in this Torah portion by Itzi, and talking about it. He left. Genesis 28. So this Torah portion begins with Jacob leaving. He's left. He's been warned by family because Esau is mad at him, intending to kill him. But he is continuing his journey away from the land. But before he leaves, before he's completely gone and has no uncertain future, any doubt, before he has any doubt in his mind about what's happened in the past with his brother, with his father, with the meal and the disguise and all that stuff, with the blessing, was it his, was it stolen? Those kind of questions need to be answered right off the bat. What did God really think about this situation? Did he approve? What was Jacob's place in this plan, or is all of that up in the air because of everything that had happened? So we read some of these just a little bit ago. It says, then Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he happened upon a certain place, spent the night there, for the sun had set. And so he took one of the stones from the place and put it by his head and lay down in that place, and he dreamed. All of a sudden there was a stairway set up on the earth, and its top reaching to the heavens. Behold, the angels of God going up and down on it. Jacob has, before he has left the land, he has this encounter, his own meeting with God, unlike anything we get the impression that he had ever really experienced. He may have been told about things all his life. He may have heard from Isaac, his father, or Abraham, his grandfather. But until ADONAI appeared to him, he may not have fully known or understood everything. Jacob may never have made his own type of covenant or commitment with God. How many of us have been in similar situations, where we hear our parents talk about things. God spoke with my father. I've always been in his house. I've always been under his roof, under his protection. And Jacob benefited from all of that. He from the blessing, from the promise, from the protection, from that arrangement that had been made between ADONAI and Isaac. And again, that's so much of our own experience. If you have that opportunity to grow up in homes where you hear your parents talk about their life, when you hear them talk about their faith, and so much of it doesn't necessarily make sense. Their experiences don't really fit with ours. We've never experienced some of those things for ourselves. And it's hard for us until we have that moment. Until God appears and speaks with us. And it's not something just an abstract, something what we've heard our parents tell us about, but it's our own. That's something that I pray for my own children, my own kids. They're not kids anymore, but it's something that you should be praying for yours, something that we should be praying for these ones here, that they have their own encounter and moment with God so that the faith becomes real to them. And it's not about my faith as dad anymore, but it's about their faith. Jacob sees in this opening sequence, he sees this stairway ascending into heaven with the angels, with the servants of God ascending, to the temple in heaven, to his throne, and they're descending to the earth from the heavens with his commands, his instructions, his orders. And this uses a lot of imagery in this moment, mirroring what's going to be in the future, that future temple that's on earth in Jerusalem as the people of God ascend the stairs to go into his presence. And each person is supposed to approach that throne of grace and have that time with him. He invites us into his presence. And this is Jacob's moment. This is that time where he has that opportunity to meet with God, and for God to put aside any doubt about their relationship, any doubt about his future, or whether God accepts him. And so we continue to read. He says, surprisingly, ADONAI was standing on top of it. On this vision, there's various ways of translating this, but he said, I am ADONAI, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. So he's acknowledging, yeah, I've had relationship with them. He says, the land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your seed. He says, your seed will be as the dust of the land, and you will burst forth from the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed, and in your seed. So all those things he'd heard his parents, his father and grandfather talk about, all of a sudden God's talking about that with him. And with full knowledge of who Jacob is, with a full knowledge and understanding of everything that Jacob had done, that we tend to come down on him for and all of that experience, in spite of all of that, God passes on the promise. There's no word of rebuke. There is no condemnation for the past, only the promise of the future. And that's important. God doesn't condemn him. Jacob is the one that God wants to pass everything. All of his redemptive plans are going to be going on in and through Jacob. What we think of Jacob is, what I grew up hearing all the time as the deceiver, as the trickster, that's obviously not how God sees him. God sees a man of faith. God sees a man of promise. ADONAI has put his stamp of approval on Jacob in this statement. I'm giving it all to you. I'm passing it on to you. It's his stamp of approval that the enemy has been trying to hide and corrupt and slander ever since. Y'all realize that? He's been trying to undermine God's assessment of Jacob. You know, when God himself has no word of rebuke or correction, it baffles me to think of why we look so hard for one. You know, we have our commentaries and our sermons, you know, for so long have tried to undermine Jacob and his character. And I think what it is I think the enemy knows that if he can slander and ruin Jacob's reputation, the reputation of all of Jacob's children, of the Jewish people, is also likewise tarnished. That's how he wants to do things. He's not just interested in ruining Jacob's character. He's interested in ruining all of their character. You know, essentially the whole thing about we don't want to have anything to do with those kind of people. They're just like the ones who parrot back the words of Esau. You know, isn't he rightly named Jacob? You know, he who deceives and steals and takes and corrupts. As if this world would be so much better if those descendants of Jacob weren't here, those Jewish people. Right, y'all? Has that been sticking up a little bit more, its ugly head, in the last year or so? Those people tear us down, they ruin us, so let's treat them badly, let's kick them out. Which is exactly the opposite of God's promise. That he will bless those who bless the Jewish people and curse those who curse them. See, the enemy is deceiving the world to reject that promise, to reject God's blessing, and essentially bring the curse upon themselves by hating on the Jewish people. And it all starts, it has this nice biblical foundation with the slandering of Jacob. And instead, you know, Jacob, like the other patriarchs, he's an example of faith and a demonstration of what would come in the future of God's people. Remember, I've talked about this before, you know, what happens to the patriarchs, that's believed and understood in Jewish understanding to be repeated in their descendants. This is what one of their commentaries, the Rambam, talks about. Hello, if I can get it there. Where'd it go? Going the wrong direction. He says, I will tell you a principle by which you will understand all the coming portions of Scripture concerning Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is indeed a great matter, which our rabbis mention briefly, saying, whatever has happened to the patriarchs is a sign to the children. It gets mirrored. There's something there to talk about the descendants. And what has God promised? What has He just promised to Jacob that will resonate throughout those generations? He says in verse 15 of Genesis 28, behold, I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not forsake you until I have done what I promised you. When you look at that promise that He just has given to Jacob, God's promise to Jacob and to that future, He says, I am going to be with you. You know, this was true for Jacob's life, and it's true and is continued true to this day. He was with Jacob, and He has been with His people all along to this day. He says, I will watch over you, and that's talking about keeping or guarding you, just like with how they're supposed to keep and guard the Shabbat. ADONAI He guarded Jacob throughout this entire Torah portion. He still guards and protects and watches over the Jewish people to this day. It says, and I will bring you back to the land. You know, ADONAI promised that despite being scattered among the nations, just as He returned Jacob to the land, He has and He will continue to return the Jewish people to the land. And despite, you know, all the best attempts of replacement theology to convince the world otherwise, ADONAI has not forsaken or replaced His people with another. I will not forsake you. I will fulfill my promises. When you look at what replacement theology tries to do, what it tries to say, is also called supersessionism. That, you've heard variations of this in various places. So this is not a full or complete description, but it's something along the lines of how God has set aside Israel and made, the church the new Israel. Y'all have heard some things like that, right? That the new and improved people of God. And I saw two expressions of it, or two ways of talking about it, and one of them called it like an economic supersessionism, that the role of the Jewish people is completed, mission accomplished. Once Yeshua was born, once the birth of Messiah came, well, now their job is done, and they're not really needed anymore. This is kind of the nicest version, you could say. The other one is called the punitive supersessionism, where He is cast them aside as punishment because they didn't recognize the time of His appearing, right? So it's a form of punishment for him. That God is finished with Israel as a nation and as a people, as this ethnic identity, that the promises and blessings that God made to Israel, all those things that He says in the Old Testament, has been passed on to somebody else, inherited by the church. That if they don't have the promises anymore, what remains are all those negatives, are all those curses. Right? These perspectives dominated a lot of church history, sadly enough. And it's still around today. This is a guy in the 80s who wrote this. He says, the Jewish nation no longer has a place as a special people of God. That place has been taken by the Christian community, which fulfills God's purposes for Israel. Okay, so that one's a proponent of this perspective just from the 80s. But I found another one I want to see if you've heard before. This is the quote. It says, "For such ruthless wrath of God," so he's talking about the punishment, the punitive side of things, "is sufficient evidence that they, the Jewish people, assuredly have erred and gone astray. Even a child can comprehend this, for one dare not regard God as so cruel that he would punish his own people so long, so terrible, so unmercifully. Therefore, this work of wrath is proof that the Jews, surely rejected by God, are no longer his people, and neither is he any longer their God." Anyone want to take a guess who said that? Martin Luther did in one of his last publications. So, replacement theology is why many throughout church history thought it's now okay to treat the Jewish people badly because of all those promises are null and void. They no longer have any status or place in God's plan. When you look at those expressions, is bringing about the Messiah through the Jewish people, is that one of their most important missions and roles that God uses them for? Sure it is. Is that the only role that he has for them? No. Are there consequences for not recognizing Messiah when he came? Sure. Just like there were consequences for the generation that came out of Egypt but were unwilling to enter the promised land. But that mean he threw them all away? No. For replacement theology to be true, we make God the one who breaks his promise, a violator of his covenant. And that impugns him and his character. Because, we all fall short of the glory of God. We all don't fulfill our role in our side of things, don't we? I sure hope he wouldn't treat us that way. That he would just, okay, you messed up, you're gone. So even when the people break the covenant, he never does. He has not dismissed them or broken any of his promises. He always leaves a remnant. He always has that call to come back home. And just like we expect him to keep his promises to us, even though we let him down, he will not neglect from keeping his promises to them. He has made promises that he will keep to Jacob. He's made promises that have been passed on to Jacob's descendants that are binding until he fulfills them. And the Jewish people are still waiting for all of these promises to be fulfilled, just like we are waiting for the promises of the kingdom, with the descendant of David on the throne, that wait for the Messianic era. They're waiting for that just as we do. And those Aramaic translations, those Targums, reinforce the role of Messiah in all of this. This is what it's said in the traditional Hebrew text. It says, "I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not forsake you until I have done what I promised you." Look what it says in the Aramaic, the Targum. Roughly from the 1st century era. Notice who's acting in place of is a representative of ADONAI, is equal to him. He says, "Behold, my word, that Memra, is for thy help, and will keep thee in every place where thou shalt go, and will bring thee again to this land, for I will not leave thee until the time when I have performed all that I have told thee." In the Hebrew passage, it's ADONAI who does these things. In the Aramaic, it's the Memra who does these things. The Word, who's the visible acting agent, the visible image of the invisible God, the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his being. The Memra represents this divine manifestation of God acting as his messenger or as his intermediary between God and humanity, especially when describing his actions. It's this way of expressing God's power without compromising his transcendence. That was the concern. But it's a perfect picture of Messiah. The Word that was with God, and the Word that was God, and the Word that became flesh and tabernacled among us. It's the Memra who is Jacob's help. It's the Word that is Jacob's help. It's the Messiah who is Jacob's help and the help of his descendants. It's the Word, i.e. the Messiah, who will keep and guard Jacob and his descendants every place that they go. It's the Word, it's the Messiah who will bring Jacob and his descendants back again to this land. It's the Word, it's the Messiah who will not leave Jacob nor his descendants until he performs and fulfills every promise. And for Jacob, this is his moment. This is his moment with God when his faith, comes out from under the shadow of his father and grandfather and becomes his own, when he begins to see God working in his own life. It says, and Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, verily the glory of the Lord Shekinah dwelleth in this place, and I did not know it, I knew it not. It says, so he was afraid, and he said, how fearsome this place is. This is none other than the house of God. This must be the gate of heaven. And early in the morning Jacob got up and took the stone which he had placed by his head, and set it up as a memorial stone, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, though originally the city's name was Luz. And this is how we know that it's his own. It says, then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and watch over me on this way that I am going, and provide me food to eat and clothes to wear, and I return in shalom to my father's house, then ADONAI will be my God. God, if you do all of that, if you fulfill all these things that you just said, then we're not going to have a problem, are we? We're going to be in relationship. I'm gonna follow you. Now it's his faith. He's experiencing it for himself. And again, what's interesting, the Aramaic puts it like this. It says, and Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if the Memra of the Lord will be my helper, and will keep me from shedding innocent blood, and from strange worship, and from impure converse or conversation, in this way that I am going, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to wear, and will bring me back in peace to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be ordained for the house of the sanctuary of the Lord. And upon it shall generations worship the name of the Lord, and of all that thou mayest give me, the 10th will I separate before thee. In other words, he's saying that this stone is going to be used in some form or some fashion in future worship, maybe even in the temple itself. But Jacob, he is going to experience all of this, everything that he's talking about here in the days ahead. And he wants his life to reflect the ways of God, to be essentially a blameless man, a man of integrity, even when going out into the world, even when you're having to go out and deal with and interact with people and men like Laban. He still wants to be a person of integrity that doesn't want to shed innocent blood. He doesn't want to worship false gods. He doesn't want to do any of that kind of stuff. And God, through the agency of the Memra, is going to prove himself true in all of it during his lifetime. ADONAI will also prove to continue all of these promises and all of these blessings wherever Jacob goes. And, I shared in last week how Abraham and Isaac as they're going out into the land and they're interacting with the Philistines and the other peoples that are there, how they have this uncanny ability to dig a well and find water. Y'all remember that? In all these arid places where no one else has done it, how God essentially through them is bringing the land to life. He's making it fruitful, and how God uses his people to not just be a blessing to their own family, but to bless the land and the peoples around it, in contrast to the Philistines and everybody else. And it's that pattern that we see even at work in our own day of life and destruction, whether you're going to burn down the crops or cut down the orchards and the vineyards, all those things. But remember, it says, all of the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up and filled with dirt. So one was about trying to make the land thrive and abundant, while the others were trying to keep it desolate. In verse 18, it says, Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. The Philistines had stopped them up after Abraham's death. He gave them the same names that his father had given them. Verse 22 says, Then he moved on from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. Now, this is after he had dug several and found water. But now he digs another one, and they're not arguing over it. He named the place Wide Spaces and said, because now ADONAI has created wide spaces for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. Remember, he had sown crop, and it returned 100-fold what was sown. Verse 25, it says, He built an altar there and called on the name of ADONAI. He pitched his tent there, and Isaac's servants hollowed out a well. So wherever they were going in the land, wherever this family was going, and wherever the Jewish people go in general, God's blessing can follow, can be a blessing to the place that they go, to the nation that they go. And the thing throughout history is the better that the Jewish people do in a nation, the better that nation as a whole does. If the Jewish people have a safe haven where they can settle, where they can thrive, with minimal persecution, with some type of sanctioned protection, then those communities, those nations will prosper as a result, and it's a pattern throughout history. But what happens when all of those nations and peoples turn against the Jewish people, then all that prosperity then begins to turn down, and the collapse soon follows. Stopping up the wells is rejecting the blessing of God's people. That's like persecuting them and kicking them out. But look at what happens when Jacob arrives in Laban's land. He's on this journey. He's going to find his family. This is how it's understood in the Aramaic, in those translations. It says, And Jacob lifted up his feet lightly to proceed, and he came to the land of the children of the cast. And I'm not entirely sure what that entirely means. But it says, He looked and he saw, and behold, there was a well in a field, and behold, there 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because from that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was laid upon the mouth of the well. There's nothing really different about any of that stuff yet, right? You've read the Torah portion this week, right? So you should know all of this by now. But look at what happens to the well once Jacob shows up in verse 10. It was when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went nigh and rolled the stone with one of his arms from the mouth of the well. So he was either strong enough to do it all by himself with just one hand, or it wasn't really as big of a job as all those shepherds really thought it was or claimed it was. And the well then uprose. Here's the thing. The well uprose, and the waters ascended to the top of it, and he watered the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, and it uprose for 20 years. So how does this typically work, right? There's a stone covering the well, And then they would have to take a bucket of some kind, a rope of some kind, right? Lower it down to where the water level is, and then bring it back out. Something's changed. This is how it's understood in the first century, right? In the days of Yeshua. That the well was no longer a deep well, but that the waters rose all the way up to the top. You didn't need a bucket anymore. And it uprose for 20 years. It rose up. It essentially was overflowing. It was no longer just a hole in the ground that needed to be capped so nobody falls in. It's now essentially a spring. And it lasts for 20 years. And how long is Jacob with Laban in the land before going home? He's there for 20 years. He's working 7 or really 14 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. Then he works another 6 years for his own wages. And in that time, what happens to Laban? It says that when Laban heard the account of the strength and piety of Jacob, the son of his sister, how he had taken the birthright and the order of blessing from the hand of his brother, and how the Lord had revealed himself to it at Bethel, how the stone had been removed, and how the well had upflowed and risen to the brink, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and led him into his house, and he related to Laban all these things. For a time, Laban understood a good thing when he had it. You know, you appreciate things when you realize what they're worth. And he wanted to keep this blessing as close as possible for as long as possible. That's why he deceived Jacob with Leah, right? This is the first century understanding of things. It says Laban, and again, I don't say that all of this is absolutely true, because this is things that are commentary on the scriptures, but this is how it's understood. It says, Laban gathered all the men of the place and made them a feast. Answering, he said to them, Behold, 7 years since Jacob came to us, the wells have not failed, and the watered places are multiplied. So it's not there's more than what they had before since he's been around. And now come, let us counsel against him cunning counsel, that he may remain with us. And they gave him cunning counsel, that he should take Leah to him instead of Rachel. But remember, in all of this, he's wanting to keep Jacob around. But remember, it's the Memra, it's the word of the Lord who is Jacob's help. And Laban understands, he knows that he is blessed by having him near. And so when Jacob asks to leave, he finds another way to make him stay. It was after Rachel gave birth to Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, Send me away so that I can go to my place and to my land. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you yourself know my labor that I have served you. But Laban said to him, Well, if I found favor in your eyes, I've looked for good omens, and ADONAI has blessed me because of you. He knows it. Laban, like the nations, is blessed. And Jacob knows the blessing that has come with him to the foreign land. In chapter 30, verse 29, he says, You yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had very little before I came. And we talked about that last night, how the Targums reveal some things about that. But it's been busting at the seams in abundance. So ADONAI has blessed you with my every step. But now that Jacob, this is that the remaining 6 years, Jacob starts working to build his own wealth, his own family. Laban starts to then twist and mistreat Jacob and tries to manipulate him and cheat him even more. He tries to control the outcome of Jacob's wages At one point, he removes all the animals that he had asked for. He changes his wages from the spotted to the striped. He does this like 10 times, trying to limit what Jacob receives and maximize what he gets. But all of that only made Jacob more successful because the word of the Lord, the Memra of the Lord, was his help. Everything that Laban did to make it harder for Jacob made it better for Jacob. And the blessing that Laban experienced by treating Jacob relatively well began to fade and decrease. The worse that he treated Jacob, the less he got. Chapter 31 says, Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons. They were saying, Jacob has taken everything that belongs to our father, and from what belongs to our father he has made all these riches. Jacob's taken. Sounds a whole lot like Esau in that charge. He's cheating us when the whole time they were trying to cheat him. It says, Then Jacob saw Laban's face, and he noticed that his expression wasn't the same as it was just a day or two before. So now his treatment of him is turning to the worse. And when God told Jacob to go home, to return to the land, just as he had promised to take him, Jacob described again this relationship with Laban like this. Talking to Rachel and Leah, he says, I can see by your father's face that his expression isn't the same as it was just a day or two ago, but the God of my father has been with me. Now you yourselves know that I have served your father with all of my strength, yet your father has fooled around with me and has changed my salary 10 times, but God has not allowed him to harm me. Is God keeping his promise to Jacob? Yes. And even Rachel and Leah recognize that their father's wealth has become Jacob's, so they were ready to go and ready to leave with him. And in all of this, Jacob knew that God was his protector and his provider. Verse 41 says, This is how it's been for me 20 years in your house. I've served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your flocks, and you have changed my salary 10 times. Had I not had the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed. That's how the nations have tried to treat the Jewish people ever since. But God saw my misery and the toil of my hands, and last night he became the judge. What's happening to the patriarchs is following and mirroring the things that are happening in the lives of his descendants. Remember that Jacob left. When he left, he was obeying God. God told him to go, right? He wasn't being deceitful in all of that. God told him to go, and he was obeying God. He just didn't tell Laban that he was leaving because Laban was going to try to manipulate the situation again. But the real interesting thing in all of this experience about how Jacob leaves Laban is, how did Laban know that they left? How did he figure this out? The Hebrew text in chapter 31 just puts it like this. He himself fled with everything, talking about Jacob, everything that belonged to him. He got up, he crossed the river, and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. And when Laban was told on the 3rd day after Jacob had fled, and that's really all we get. Laban was told 3 days later that he was gone. But once again, this is where looking at the Aramaic is helpful. It reveals a little more of how the Jewish people understood it in Yeshua's day. It tells us that Laban recognized that the blessing of Jacob's presence in the land was also gone. Remember what happened to the well when Jacob arrived, right? It started filling up to the top. Targum Jonathan, again, puts it like this. But after Jacob had gone, the shepherds went to the well, All of a sudden, they found no water. And they waited for 3 days, if that it might again overflow, but it overflowed not. And then came they to Laban on the 3rd day, and he knew that Jacob had fled. Laban suddenly knew, because through his righteousness it had flowed for 20 years. All of a sudden, Laban figured out what has changed. He no longer is experiencing the blessing of having Jacob there with him. The one whom God used to bring this flowing, this living water was now God and gone, and the blessing went with them. And even though Laban knew it, he was also mad about it. He also resented it. God, all for 20 years, God had been using Jacob to bless, to strengthen, to enrich Laban, to give him at least access to this living water and the light of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob settled down. He got married. He had children. He was praying for the peace of this household and this city that he was brought in, and God brought blessing with him. He was setting essentially the pattern that Jeremiah would use later after the people were sent off into exile. Y'all remember this? This is in that chapter that everybody likes to quote. For I know the plans I have for you, right? Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Great verse. Nobody knows the context because it's spoken in times of great hardship and turmoil. But he says, "Thus says ADONAI Tzavaot, the God of Israel, to all of those in captivity whom I removed as captives into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." Jacob sets the pattern for this. "Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit." Hello. "Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters and multiply there, and do not decrease." Right? Don't quit living. He says, "Also seek the shalom of the city where I took you as captives in exile, and pray to ADONAI for it, for in its shalom, in its peace, will you have shalom." Jacob brought the blessing with him, and so did they. That pattern has not changed. And what was true for Laban, he prospered and he received abundant water while Jacob was with him, who experienced God's blessing through Jacob and having Jacob with him. That's true for the nations today that have the Jewish people there. That's been the experience throughout history. And even in hard times, terrible circumstances, the Jewish people have sought to be a blessing wherever they have been scattered, especially if they follow this. So long as they follow this, and seeking the shalom of that city, shalom of that nation, and bring God's blessing with him. That pattern is still happening today. Because ADONAI, because the Memra was Jacob's help, and the word was guarding and keeping them. And he is still doing that. He is still going on today, because what is true of the patriarchs is true for their descendants. And God's promises are still true, and they are still awaiting fulfillment to this day. And while we, as the nation, as the United States or in other nations experience the greatest blessing from Jacob and his descendants, we experience the greatest blessing in all of that through the coming of Messiah, where he uses this family for. We have experienced that blessing by how those who were far off have been brought near, right? By the blood, through the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Messiah, we have been brought near. How because he came and he entered into this world and tabernacled among us, Do we get to experience the blessing of the overflow of water, the water of life? What did Yeshua say to the woman at the well and Samaritan woman? Yeshua replied to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. How does that go? Doesn't it? I meant to have the rest of this in here and I forgot to put it in there. What does John 4 say? Whoever drinks of this water that I give him shall never be thirsty. The water that I give him will become a fountain of water within him, springing up to eternal life. That's verse 14. As if the water is rising up and filling it all the way up to the top. It's almost as if they knew about this account or had heard about this account with Jacob going to see Laban. If you knew, he would have given you living water and it would have filled you up. And while we are experiencing so many of the blessings, let us not treat that blessing with contempt by treating the people through whom it came with contempt. That's what a lesson that this world needs to learn. For whatever we have done or not done to the least of these, his brothers, what does Yeshua say? You have done unto me, or you have not done. For the Memra, for the word is still with them. And he has not forgotten his promise, where he says, I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not forsake you until I have done what I have promised you. He is, at this point, not everything has been fulfilled. He is waiting for their eyes to be open, to look upon the one that they have pierced, for their hearts to turn from being unwilling to being willing. I mean, that's the pattern that Yeshua talked about. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing, and so look, your house is left to you desolate. There is judgment, there is consequence with these things. For I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, Baruch haba b'shem ADONAI, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And we Gentiles have experienced grace and blessing, as Romans talks about it, because of their misstep. But what will their acceptance be but life from the dead, the Messianic era in all of its fullness, with all of those promises brought to bear? And what a great and glorious day that will be. And may that day come quickly. In our day, where we can truly see the water rising up and filling all of our needs up unto eternal life.